Today's guest, RJ Carter, writes the classic character Remo Williams.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. My guest today writes for the classic novel series, The Destroyer, which features the character of Remo Williams. My only experience with the character, since I haven't read any of the novels, is the 1985 movie, which when I was about 12 or 13 years old, just absolutely loved. After our conversation, I remembered that I had seen the TV pilot as well. I just didn't remember that. But I loved that movie when I was a kid, so it was an absolute treat just being able to interview my guest today and just to learn more about the crazy, crazy world of Remo Williams. My guest today is a novelist who is writing novels featuring the character Remo Williams. RJ Carter. RJ, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
My introduction and really only experience with the character Remo Williams comes from the 1985 movie. So can we just start off by letting some listeners know who may not be familiar with the character Remo Williams, where does the character come from?
Well, the character Remo Williams comes from the minds of Warren Murphy and Richard Sapir, who were, cranking out pulp stories in the late 60s, which is when they created Remo. Now, this was back when martial arts was this very new thing to the United States. It was, it's very mysterious, very omnipotent kind of power to have if you knew karate. So they decided that in the first book, that was going to be what Remo was going to be taught, was karate, so he could be an assassin. Looking back on that now, we kind of laugh at that. But that first book didn't get picked up for publication until 1971. So that was officially when Created the Destroyer was published. And most of the fans say that it was about book 3 when the lore started to really pick up. And we built this mythos around Sinanju, the sun source of all martial arts, and his becoming an assassin.
I guess the genre would be like spy or spy thriller kind of thing?
It's a very indefinable genre. I mean, it's definitely men's adventure. It's in the lines of The Executioner or Able Team or any of those kind of things, but it's also very standout from that as well. Any of those guys you can sort of interchange and just give them the same gun and go off and they'll fight the mob or whatever. Remo Williams is, first of all, he doesn't use weapons. He is the weapon. He is the assassin. He's paired with Master Chun, who is somewhere between 80 and 500 years old, and is as smart as a whip and as smart as a boot. Mm-hmm. And he always keeps Remo in line. The adventures are frequently over the top, satirical kind of things. When he was first put out into the field, he's a member of CURE. In fact, he's half of CURE, which is all capital letters and not an acronym for anything. CURE was established in the past by a former president who realized that if we continued to work inside the Constitution to defend the Constitution, the country would fall apart. We were hampering ourselves. So he created CURE, which was just Dr. Harold Smith, former CIA, former OSS, pretty much got the job because he had no imagination and thus no ambition. They gave him an ink blot test and they said, "What do you see?" He said, "I see an ink blot." So he got that job, and his job was basically to monitor for signs of corruption throughout the United States, whether they be in the banking industry, in the unions, in the police. And then he would make sure that information made its way into the hands of law enforcement surreptitiously so that it could be handled by the proper channels after he'd gotten them through the improper channels. After a while of this, though, it became apparent that this was not going to be enough. So they recruited Remo Williams. And by recruited, I mean that they framed him for a murder and had him executed.
Okay.
When he came to, because obviously the execution was faked, he was told, hey, you're a former cop. You have a very deep sense of patriotism. You have no family. No one's going to miss you. Here's the job. If you don't want it, we already have the headstone planted, and we can put you under it just as easily as we just pulled you out of it. So he was reluctantly trained into this art, and was also reluctantly trained by Master Chun, who knew that he was going to be training somebody, but then he saw it was, first of all, an adult, and second of all, a white man. He just assumed to be an impossible task and distasteful to this ancient North Korean.
Okay. I guess, could you explain Sinanju a little bit more?
Sinanju, yes. Sinanju is the sun source of all martial arts. Now, if you would imagine that Sinanju was the Library of Congress, and you were allowed to go into that library with a Post-it note and an ink pen and spend a half an hour in there. Mm-hmm. And everything you could write on that Post-it note was all the information you could take out and escape with your life. Mm-hmm. That Post-it note would be ninja. So every other martial art had its source in Sinanju. Okay. And they're all thieves and liars, and they just infiltrated and took what they could and ran like cowards.
He's, Remo Williams is his character in novels. How many novels are there?
As of 2 Saturdays ago, there are 153.
153.
There are also a couple of novellas and the 2 anthologies. The second anthology was called More Blood, mm-hmm. which was basically a call to the fans to write their own Remo stories or Sinanju stories or stories set in that world. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where they found me. I answered the call and turned in a short novella, and turned out that it landed me a gig I wasn't even aware I was applying for.
Well, that's amazing. I guess just a little bit more about that. So you wrote essentially fan fiction, and then now you've got the job of writing the novels?
It was it definitely started out as a fan fiction. I had to play with it a little bit to become more publishable. The title of it was called Fool's Paradise. And to backtrack on that, Remo's got a few recurring antagonists, if you will. Mm-hmm. Very few, because he's an assassin, and if he has multiple recurring antagonists, he's not very good at his job.
Sure.
One of these recurring antagonists is called Friend. Friend is an AI who his whole purpose is to generate profit. And he has no, remorse for loss of life if it causes money to be accumulated. Mm-hmm. He's a computer program. He lives on a chip. Well, I had just recently got into the Destroyer when I was writing this. A friend of mine had introduced me to the 4 books that were being published by Tor that year. And I was like, this is really fun. And plus, it looks very familiar. So when the call came in, I'm like, I'm going to do this and see if they bite on it. And I had Remo have to go after a mutated version of Friend who had basically become insane. Mm-hmm. And all he wanted to do was just kill people for laughs. He became insane because some pale-skinned, green-haired psychopath in an asylum upstate had released a computer virus through a janitor that got into the Cure computers, found a copy of Friend, and mutated it. This caused Remo to have to track it down, which takes him upstate New York to a very dark section, a very gothic section of New York, shall we say, mm-hmm. And be at odds with a vigilante who dresses like Dracula. So obviously a lot of trademarks had to be pulled from that story to make it workable. I don't know how many times I did global replace on things to say, okay, if it says back this or back that, call it the car, call it the signal. Uh-huh. The commissioner is just the commissioner.
No, that sounds great. So then you wrote this and then the publisher reached out to you?
The publisher reached out to me, said they were accepting the story. And I was like, I was just giddy at that. I was like, all right, I've only had, 2 novels published at this point, and they were both through a company in England. So this was my first American publication.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I'll get a copy of the book, right? And it was Devin Murphy who was communicating with me, who's the son of Warren Murphy, the creator of the series. And he said, yeah, we also think you have the voice down for the character rather well. Would you be interested in taking on the series? And I was like, you take on a series that had a movie done in 1985 and is currently rumored to have another movie under production with Shane Black directing. Well, let me see if my calendar has time for that. Oh, yep, it does. I'll be right there.
Yeah. How long did that decision take?
Well, I had to backspace a few times because my fingers were trembling. So it took a little longer than I wanted it to. It took about 5 seconds instead of the 3 that it should have.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's amazing. I just find it incredible that nowadays you could write fan fiction and then end up writing for the series.
Well, if you want to write for a series, you do have to show somehow that you have a handle on the characters.
Sure.
So basically, any submission that you turn into any franchise is going to be fan fiction until they accept it.
Sure.
This wasn't, previously published like that, and it was actually a call from the actual publisher. So whether or not anything they published was going to be canon or not was up in the air. Obviously, I don't believe my story was canon, so they're probably not. Mm-hmm. But it was, officially recognized by Destroyer Books and the estate of Warren Murphy. Wasn't the estate at the time; he was still with us. Warren unfortunately passed while he was editing my first manuscript, Bully Pulpit. I sometimes say that my writing killed him.
I guess just to clarify for some people, the book series is actually called The Destroyer. It's not called Remo Williams.
It is called The Destroyer. Yes.
Okay. So
there's a whole backstory to why it's called that, and there's mythology and prophecy. Basically, Remo and Chun, they're the prototype and the blueprint for what ultimately became this trope of the white Westerner learning ancient Eastern arts and becoming an Avenger. So before Iron Fist, there was Remo.
Just interesting to hear, some of these stories. So then, you've taken over the franchise, and you just mentioned your first one was Bully Pulpit.
That is correct.
Okay, what is that book about?
That book, well, one of the early novels that they did was Dr. Quake. And this was about a scientist who could induce earthquakes using a water laser fired at fissures. So that was, it was a fun book. But I had this novel that had been kicking around in the back of my head for literally decades. Mm-hmm. And it had come from when I had read some works on Nikola Tesla. And now, Tesla had done some experiments with telegeodynamics, which was he was vibrating things. Mm-hmm. And he had found that everything had a vibrational rate. And if he countered that rate, he could break it apart. He would do it with steel I-beams. He would shatter glass down the block just by using a 2.5 horsepower engine. Mm-hmm. And he had said that he had calculated the periodicity rate of the Earth's vibration to be 1 hour and 49 minutes, by which he means that if you strike the Earth hard enough, that wave will take 1 hour and 49 minutes to go to the core and bounce back. Mm-hmm. And he said if you were to set off 1,000 pounds of dynamite every hour and 49 minutes, it was guaranteed that within 2 months, there would be irreversible earthquakes and tremors, and that shortly after that, the Earth would crack like a boy would crack an apple. This sent people into a panic, and he had to print a retraction in Hearst magazine. Mm-hmm. And said, okay, well, in theory, it would work, but no one can tell when the actual ebb and peak of these periods are. We don't have the technology. We'll never have the technology. Don't worry about it. It can never happen. Mm-hmm. Well, I got to thinking about, oil exploration going on today and all the geology surveys we do. I'm like, I bet we can figure that out now. But who would want to do such a thing? So I had this character in mind who was a televangelist. And I made him different from the stereotypical televangelist in that he actually believed and lived by what he preached. Mm-hmm. And he had gotten this way. He'd gotten rich because he was that way. Some reporter had tried to cash in on the whole corrupt televangelists theme that was going on for a while. and had printed a story that wasn't true. And when people found out that, oh, look, this guy really is honest, he really is putting his money where he says he is, he really is living modestly, we like him, we'll tune into him, we'll give money to him, and he just rose to stardom, and he stayed a true believer. Now, what he believes in is that God has promised to come back and save those who are lost and rapture them to heaven. But he is so saddened by the fact that people who are of the faith fall away from the faith and are lost to eternity, lost to hell, that he can't believe God is waiting so long. So when he discovers, he decides that he can, while he knows he's sending himself to hell if he goes through with this, he quotes the Apostle Paul, who says, I would wish myself accursed that my brethren might be saved. His plan is to blow up the earth. And in so doing, before that can happen, God has to come back and rescue what faith will remain. So, he's giving these people jobs and demolition jobs and construction jobs. And he's being lauded in the media for this. But you can only blow up so many buildings under the guise of construction and set off so many, 1,000 pounds of dynamite force against the surface of the earth under that guise. So he starts supplying terrorists with these backpack bombs and says, here, go blow up whatever you need to blow up, whatever message you need to send. But he doesn't tell them that there are timers in each one hidden inside, so that each bomb is going to go off at the precise moment it needs to. So we have these terrorists that look very inept because sometimes they're blowing themselves up on the way to a location. And Remo comes into it because he's after the terrorists, who are called the Yahomar.
Okay, so that was just your first novel. What about the second one that you've written?
The second novel was a bit more of a recurring character this time. The previous one, while there was a minor recurring character, it wasn't Dr. Quake because he was, of course, killed in that book. The second novel was Continental Divide, and that featured the return of a character called Mr. Gordons. Mr. Gordons is an android, a fabrication machine, and his origin was tied up with NASA in the 70s, where he was going to be the AI engine of an interstellar probe, and his prime directive, if you will, was that he was programmed to survive. Whatever happens, survive. So, asteroids coming, make a course correction, solar flare on the way, do whatever it takes to rearrange the ship and make it survivable. Well, he's just sitting there in his little box on his little table at NASA, and he overhears his drunken female creator crying about how funding has been pulled. They've taken the money. There's no way the program can survive. Mm-hmm. Triggers the AI into thinking, okay, I must survive, and that takes money. And that gave birth to the Destroyer novel Funny Money, where he's counterfeiting bills. He's literally making money to survive. Mm-hmm. And he recognizes Remo and Chun as a threat to his survival during that story. And every encounter thereafter has always been him trying to figure out a way to eliminate the House of Sinanju so that he can survive, because he recognizes it as a threat against him. He's destroyed many times, but he can rebuild himself. He's a shape. He can refabricate himself to look like an office chair or an airplane, and he has done these things. So you never know where he is or when he's listening. In Continental Divide, he's conscripted by somebody who knows of his existence and finds him for a diversionary plan, a diversionary tactic. There's a financier, a CEO, whose company is secretly on the verge of bankruptcy, and he's trying to raise capital to resuscitate it. Well, one of his companies is air freight shipments. He's like UPS and FedEx. He flies packages from one end of the country to the other. Mm-hmm. And he's figured out that if he can, get more shipments to go air freight, that would be enough to save him from bankruptcy. Well, how can you get more air freight shipments? You make it impossible to do ground freight shipments. So Mr. Gordon's job is to take down bridges along the Mississippi River. All of them.
Okay.
Just totally unzip the country, so that you can't get from west to east or east to west without the use of a plane.
Mm-hmm.
And he figures he'll go undetected because all the air freight companies would go up. A rising tide raises all boats.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, he's being duped as well by the person who gave him the idea, because that person also knows about Cure, and he's using this outlandish idea because he knows it's just weird enough to get Cure's attention.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to draw Remo out.
Mm-hmm.
And this, of course, also happens during, when I was writing it, it was during the presidential debates. So you have the billionaire real estate tycoon, Kendall T. Rump, in debates against the former First Lady and former Secretary of State, who always go unnamed, but you know who they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a lot of satire hitting both sides of that debate.
Okay. And then what about your third novel?
The third novel is the one that just came out. That's called Monumental Terror. And that's one of those ripped from the headlines, where it's all about the protests and the alt-right versus the Antifa groups over Confederate monuments. They're building the tension. The country's on a powder keg. We're divided 50-50 over our ideals. And anything could spark off the next great civil war. Well, what they find out is that it's one person controlling both sides, and he's playing them off of each other to gin up emotions across the country so that they can fix the Constitution by making people sick of it. If you see so much atrocity covered under the umbrella of free speech, if you see so many shootings protected under the Second Amendment, I'm not sure that we're quartering soldiers yet, so the third one's probably fine. But if you start seeing the Constitution excuse so many inexcusable things, then you open up your mind to the idea that, maybe we should just trash the whole thing and start over. Well, this is a constitutional protection issue, of course, and that's exactly what Cure's purview was. Mm-hmm. So Remo is called into that, and he infiltrates both sides of the protest, and also uncovers that this latest protest is a cover for a presidential assassination plot. It's been my favorite one so far to write. I mean, I'm after three of them, you start to get into the character's head. Yeah.
Oh, I can imagine. And so you said that one just came out a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, that was published Saturday before Archon, when we met at Archon.
Okay.
So that'd be end of September.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's great. I guess, too, just for people who aren't familiar, let's just talk about the 1985 movie just a little bit. What are your thoughts about that movie?
Well, that movie was very 1980s. It's the best we've got, and it's the only we've got. So that makes it the best we've got. I liked Fred Ward. I liked the character, and there were many, many scenes in there that were absolutely true to the Destroyer series. Probably not coincidentally, they were all the scenes that involved Remo and Chun interacting with each other. Mm-hmm. The scene where Remo is sent in, says, "Look, I don't want to have to kill you. They sent me in here to do this, old man. Just let me out the back door." And Chun's like, "Oh, it's far too late for that already. You're going to have to kill me." And he's dodging the bullets. Mm-hmm. That was classic. Later on in the movie, where Remo is traversing the obstacle course that his room has become, mm-hmm. and then Chun says, "Now do it again." And he starts it again, and he turns out the lights on him. That was exactly the kind of thing that Chun would do.
Yeah, I mean, well, like I said at the beginning, I remember watching it, and it would have been on VHS probably in, probably 1987 or something like that. But I mean, me and I guess some of my friends and my brother and maybe a cousin or two, we wanted to train like Remo. Like we wanted to be trained like him.
Good luck.
Yeah, no kidding. But I mean, I think we did build an obstacle course of some kind, but not to the level that was in the movie.
There's so much training stories. For years, every Destroyer novel had another training sequence in it because Remo was getting stronger and getting better. He wasn't a master of Sinanju for a long time. And to be able to tell all those stories and get it right and squeeze it, you can't do it in a movie. It would make a great Netflix series.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you'd be able to watch the character grow. You wouldn't have to say, introduce the character, training. Okay, climax of story, he's a Superman now. Now, what a lot of people don't know when they think about the movie is that there was a television pilot.
Yeah.
And that's actually available on YouTube. And that is, if Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins was very 1980s, the television pilot was quintessentially MTV. He had the Flock of Seagulls haircut. And as much as they, talk about how the character of Chun was whitewashed by casting Joel Grey as a Korean,
Mm-hmm.
The television series one-upped that by casting Roddy McDowall.
I when I was preparing for the interview, I realized that there was a television pilot, but I don't know if I've ever seen that one. I'll have to check that one out on YouTube if it's out there.
Well, the character in the television pilot, he was very hung up on learning the 37 steps to sexually gratifying a woman beyond all means. And he's like, come on, Chun, I want to know. I know the first step. It starts with tapping on the wrist, right? Come on. He's like, you are not ready for such knowledge.
Oh, gosh. Okay. That sounds interesting. Now,
by the way, Remo in the books has this knowledge.
Oh, okay.
And uses it.
Aha. Now, how has the character, since they were first published in like 1971, then how does the character, like, does the character just happen contemporarily no matter what time period, or?
That's the way I play it. I look at Remo sort of like the way I look at Batman. I don't look at Batman as an 80-year-old character. I say, okay, Batman's been around for 10 years and it's always been 10 years. Everything's happened, but it's all happened in 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the way I treat Remo. I have to. I can't. And that's one of the brilliant things that Warren and Richard did with the books was they never got around to naming who the president was. Now, you could always tell who the president was by their dialect and their mannerisms.
Mm-hmm.
But, if the vice president walks in and the president says, Dan, what are you doing here? Well, you kind of nailed down a time period that's specific. But, other than that, no, I don't subscribe. Some fans do. I don't subscribe to the idea that Remo is in his late 60s right now and still running around doing this. It's a moving timeline.
You had mentioned you had written other novels, so you have been a novelist then for quite some time, or?
Oh, I'd been attempting for quite some time. Okay. Being one for quite some time is another story. But I got into the blood and guts, destroy the terrorist business by way of children's books.
Oh.
My first novel was called Alice's Journey Beyond the Moon. Mm-hmm. And it was written as though it were the third of the Alice trilogy, written by Lewis Carroll. I did everything in his style. I followed his grammar. I followed his typography. His whatever he did when he wrote something, that's how I would write it. And then I annotated it to the outside, saying, okay, well, Martin Gardner had done the annotated Alice because he knew what a lot of people don't, was that there was a real Alice. Mm-hmm. And that, Charles Dodgson knew this Alice and had taken her and her sisters out on a boat ride with a friend of his. And they'd all said, tell us stories. And he told her a story, and it became Alice in Wonderland when he wrote it down. Mm-hmm. But it was full of all these little in-jokes and satires that she would get because she was alive at that time and she knew these people and she knew what was going on. Mm-hmm. And over time, people who weren't contemporary to sitting on the bank hearing that story didn't get those things. So Gardner, filled out the margins of this big, thick hardcover book with everything that was going on. It was very educational and informative. I said, I want to do that. What can I do that in? Well, Neil Gaiman had published a Sandman comic wherein Lucian, the librarian of dreams, was walking us through the library of all the books that had never been published. And there was this bookshelf, and you could read in the panel things like, The Conscience of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Alice's Journey Beyond the Moon by Lewis Carroll. I'm like, oh, well, if it's never been written, I can do that one. And I stole the title. And then I sent it off to several different publishers. And Telos Publishing in the UK decided that they were going to bite on it. And I can't remember what expletives I screamed in joy and ecstasy when I got that email that they were going to do that. But I got the book. And the first thing, of course, you do when you get a book is you send it to your local newspaper and say, book review, local author. Mm-hmm. And I got the call back from, local small town paper. They said, yeah, let's meet at the library. We've got it. We've read it. We've got some questions. Mm-hmm. So I meet at the local library, and understand the introduction to the book says that there were renovations at Christ Church Library, where Charles Dodgson was a librarian during his time, and shelves were moved and discarded papers were found fallen behind shelves. They had some mathematical treatises on them. They had some doodles, and they had this manuscript that Dodgson was preparing for Alice Little's engagement to Reginald Hargreaves, and how he felt about that, what was going on at the time, and yada, yada, yada. That was the whole setup that was the MacGuffin. Mm-hmm. Well, we sit down at the library, and the reporter says, okay, so why did they call you from Conway, Arkansas when they found all these papers? And I looked at him and said, oh, you poor man. You have to throw out all your questions now and start over. But thank you for believing it.
Oh, gosh. So the reporter thought that it was all real.
The reporter thought that the style was absolutely Lewis Carroll style, which meant I had succeeded.
Well, that's a high compliment.
Well, I mean, it wasn't like he was, from Oxford or something who could fall for something like that. If I fooled one of those guys, that'd be saying something. But, it was good enough.
That was your first book. That's an incredible story.
Telos, by the way, they had the license on this character called Doctor Who while I was doing that. Uh-huh. And sometime during their tenure with that, the BBC decided to start producing Doctor Who again. They said, okay, well, we're going to get rid of your license. Mm-hmm. And Telos was like, okay, that's fine. And copyright in the UK being what it is, they took the last Doctor Who novel that they wrote and created 2 new characters in it. And these were also time-traveling characters. And because they created them, they owned them, and they could spin them out into their own series called Time Hunter. Uh-huh. So I had an idea after reading the first 4 of that. And I'm like, well, you have this guy who's living in post-war London. He's an African-American named Honoré Le Chasseur, and they make a big deal about how he talks and he says he practiced it from Louisiana with a name like that. And he obviously didn't want people to continue thinking he was French. So I took this story idea where I said, okay, well, let's explore what it means to be a Creole and living in post-war London, and who were his parents, and why is he there? Why didn't he come home? And I did a lot of research into that time period again in Louisiana, and found a group called the Royal Street Vampire Gang. Real news story. And they were, kidnapping people and draining their blood in these little wooden chairs that they would strap them into with troughs carved into the arms. Wow. And I said, well, okay, one of the victims is going to be Honoré's mother. And this has traumatized him, why his father's disappeared, his mother's been killed by the Royal Vampire Gang. And part of the story has them going to that time period. And his partner is Emily Blandish. She's a girl from the future with amnesia. She has amnesia because the doctor gave her amnesia for a very specific reason. And we don't find that out till the next book that I didn't write. George Mann wrote that one. Mm-hmm. But when they get the opportunity to save his mother, she's ready to rush in, and he stops her. He's like, no, we don't change this. And she's fighting with him to go in there and save his mom until his mom dies. And, the crux of the ending of the book was then Emily standing sideways in the door to their apartment, half in, half out, getting ready to leave. And she's crying and yelling at him saying, I always thought that if we ever found out, that there was something in my timeline that was causing me to have this amnesia, some traumatic event, that you'd be with me there to help fix it. Now I know you won't be. And she storms out, and I'm like, okay, next writer, good luck.
So you were able to get into that kind of franchise as well. That's interesting.
I was. Unfortunately, there was only one more book after that. I'm not quite sure why or what, but maybe they just finished the story that they wanted to tell. I'd love to do more Time Hunter because I had more plot threads that I left dangling in The Sideways Door that I co-wrote with Troy Reiser that I wanted to revisit, specifically why Honoré's father had disappeared.
I guess here, as we're kind of getting on here in time, we had mentioned the 1985 movie of Remo Williams, and of course, it was titled "The Adventure Begins," but there was never any follow-up to that.
Yeah, the adventure never continued.
Yes, yeah, and like I had said when I was a kid, I always wondered where the other movies were, but yeah, they weren't there. But now in the future, you had mentioned it a little bit earlier. There's another movie in the works, possibly.
Well, when we say that there's a movie in the works, Hollywood being what it is, there's a lot of movies in the works that we'll never see.
Yeah.
I always wanted to see Supermax, which was the movie where Green Arrow was sent to prison and had to fight against all the people he put there. And it took until Arrow season 7 for me to actually see the Supermax movie, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there is a screenplay that has been turned in, a treatment. I know the guy who has turned it in. He's a Destroyer writer, so he's sharp. He's on it. Mm-hmm. And Shane Black, who did Iron Man 3, he also did The Nice Guys. He's attached to direct it. It's supposed to be the next project after he does Doc Savage. Yeah. But Doc Savage also is kind of not showing any forward momentum. So we're all kind of waiting on pins and needles for probably the next 5 to 10 years, I guess, as slow as these things move.
Yeah.
Which is a shame because The Nice Guys was this 1970s noir kind of comic crime story that was a perfect setting for Destroyer setting.
I guess he's a fan of the novels then, I would assume.
I would hope so. If he's not, I'll send him some of mine if he's short of material to put in the movie.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. All right. Well, RJ, it's been great to have you on the show today. Where can people find out more about you and some of your books?
Well, the best place to go is Amazon.com. Just click on, the Destroyer Monumental Terror, and then my name will be under there. I'll have an Amazon page. It'll take you to all the other books I've done. I definitely appreciate reviews. Amazon writers, they live on the reviews more than they live on the royalty checks. Little known secret, if you have less than 50 reviews, Amazon doesn't really bother promoting you. But as soon as you get 50 and above, then Amazon starts saying, oh, you bought this book, you might like this other book. And my goal so far now is to become this other book.
All right. Well, I'll make sure to link your author page and the books in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. And again, RJ Carter, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me again, man. Appreciate it.
Hey, guys. Well, there you have it. I really hope you enjoyed today's interview with RJ Carter. As I mentioned in the show notes for this episode, which you can find at dicegeeks.com, I have linked up his author page as well as some informational links on Remo Williams. Plus, I linked up the 1985 Remo Williams movie. So if you're in the mood for some 1980s action adventure, you can check that out. If you want some free stuff, please head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get 10 free dungeon maps plus some other PDF resources you can use in your RPG campaigns. And as a bonus, you'll never miss an episode of this show. If you would consider supporting this show on Patreon, it would be greatly appreciated. Every bit of support that I get on Patreon lets me know that I should keep making this show. So you can head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, keep gaming.